Hi, I'm Daniel. This is my TED Talk. My dad's from Budapest, Hungary, and my mom is from the Hungarian part of Romania. Growing up in Washington and then Kingston, I had a similar experience to most other bilingual kids. You see, Hungarian is my mother tongue, though English has always been dominant. We'd always speak in Hungarian at home. In this, my parents were relentless. If I spoke to them in English, they would reply only in Hungarian. And if I committed the cardinal sin of mixing the two languages, I'd get in trouble. Technically, I'm an immigrant to Canada. I don't feel like an immigrant, but I don't not feel like one either. My whole life, I've been occupying this peculiar cultural middle ground. You know, I can pass for Canadian. I'm sufficiently white. My English is perfect. I understand lingo and pop culture. Though less so in Hungary, I can still pass. My accent just leads people to believe I'm from the countryside. It's manifested itself in the little things, this question of identity. I remember growing up when my friends would talk about going to their cottage for the weekend or skiing, hockey, Santa Claus, all of these Canadian things you don't really think about. I never got what they were talking about. When my friends would gripe about visiting their grandparents or Thanksgiving dinner, I could never relate. I've never had a proper Thanksgiving dinner. Hungary has always been important to me. The language, the culture, the people, the place itself. I've spent nearly every summer of my life in Hungary, and even in Canada and America, I've always been surrounded by Hungarians, other families in the same boat as us. And with all of our family being back home, we'd very frequently celebrate together, birthdays, Christmas, Easter, and the likes. You know, my identity as a Hungarian was never something I really thought about, though I guess there's always been a subliminal struggle to reconcile the dominant culture with the one we have at home. Do I call myself Canadian, which completely negates the cultural experience so essential to who I am as a person? Or do I call myself Hungarian, a place where I've never even lived? Even as a toddler, my parents tell me I initially refused to learn English because one language is enough, I don't need another one. And I was right. Growing up with two languages is really confusing. I remember one time I came home from kindergarten and I asked my mom, how do you say spaghetti in English? And she laughed at me and told me it's the same word. And then for the rest of that week, I continued to pronounce it spaghetti until a teacher finally corrected me. This stuff is hard to navigate, man. It only gets harder once you graduate. From language differences to cultural differences. I remember when my friend from Hungary moved to Kingston, and it was just this total clash of two separate aspects of my life that had never really been together before. I was confused. Being Hungarian in Canada is different from being Chinese or French or Latino because chances are there won't be many people around that speak your language. I remember in elementary school, my friends didn't know what Hungary was. They thought I was saying hungry. They'd hear me talking to my dad and think we were Russian. You know, just as I struggled with my identity, so do other immigrants. I'm not special. You know, technically, we're all Canadian, but our experiences are completely different from one another. Just saying, I'm Canadian isn't enough because it detracts from that experience. I'm not just Canadian. You know, the notion of what it means to be Canadian is changing. We like to tell ourselves that Canada started out as a country of immigrants, but that really isn't the case. First, white supremacist colonist nation. Now, well, a country of immigrants that's never had a non-white leader. Come on, guys. For the longest time, Canadian has meant white. But now, as Canada is embracing multiculturalism and flaunting its self-assessed moral superiority over the United States, what does it mean to be Canadian? Because, I mean, anyone can be Canadian. You don't even have to live here for that long. But a lot of people aren't just Canadian. They're something Canadian. If even something Canadian at all, a lot of people just drop the Canadian bit because here in Canada, everyone is Canadian. So is it even worth keeping as an identity? Well, what about the not something Canadians? What do you do when it feels like everyone else has some special moniker, but you don't? What do you do when it feels like everyone but you is allowed a unique identity? Because you see, everyone else can be something Canadian, allowed to identify more with the something when the Canadian bit doesn't suit them. Because, you know, when we're patting ourselves on the back about how not racist our country is, or how we're a mosaic, not a melting pot, or our healthcare system isn't stuck in the 17th century, or how we're better than America, then yeah, we're all Canadian. It's great. National unity, go Canada. But reconciliation? Genocide of the indigenous, residential schools, Chinese exclusion, Japanese and German internment, forced sterilization, all of a sudden, you're the Canadian while everyone else is the something. What do you do when it feels like you're being forced to take responsibility for and apologize for a past over which you as an individual have no real bearing, not because it's a national responsibility and because you're Canadian, but because you're not something Canadian? Reactionary movements are on the rise all over the globe, and Canada is no exception to this. Harmful right-wing and nationalist ideology has been spreading and festering partly as a response to immigration. Why? I would argue it's because they feel like their identity is being stolen from them and opened up to people not like them. After all, those that have been living here for hundreds of years are going to have a different cultural experience than those that arrived a decade ago. They're not the same. And that's okay. Identity is becoming ever more prevalent in our society. What with the rise of identity politics and political correctness, I think we all struggle with identity in some way, and it doesn't have to be ethnic or national. Throughout this talk, I've completely neglected to mention gender and sexuality because that's a whole other Pandora's box. I think what we have to recognize is that we're both more different and more alike than we think. And I promise that makes sense. Just imagine it like there's a big graph, but it's a Venn diagram, and there's like 10 to 15 different circles, but they're not really shaped like circles, you know? Like there's, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's one that goes around, and yeah, never mind, it's confusing. Being from Hungary has always been important to me, but so has being from Canada. And I admit, I too am guilty of some things I criticized earlier. When Canadian crimes are in the limelight, I do tend to magically feel more Hungarian. And when a Canadian comes and starts talking to me about Hungarian politics like they know stuff, I get defensive. Because, I mean, you've never lived there. You've never experienced the culture the way I have. What do you know? We can't let our differences fragment and divide our society, allowing cancers and toxicity to fester among the cracks, but we also can't erase those differences, because doing so would erase who we are and the significance of our experiences. You see, I'm not just Canadian, I'm Hungarian Canadian. We're all the same, but really not really. Finding the balance between those two things is really tricky, but that balance is what it means to be Canadian. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk.